Welcome to the third devlog of my game Trinity 64, an action-adventure monster tamer inspired by Zelda and Dark Souls, with a visual style based on the N64. In this video, I'm excited to share with you all everything I've accomplished this month, with the main highlight being the first area of the game, the Spiral Forest. A forest with spiraling trees that stretch high to the sky, with the location being corrupted by a twisted past. The way I want to structure this video is to show off this area and everything in it so far, by explaining things as we walk through it. As a disclaimer, I'm very new to being a game dev. I'm not only learning how to use Blender and animate, but also learning how to make a 3D game for the first time in general. So my goal is to keep the game's scope as small as I can. I think more about things I can omit than things I would like to add. And while that can seem boring from an outsider's perspective, I think it's absolutely necessary in order for this game to exist based on my skill level. I don't consider this game my dream game, but a game in my dream universe, so I'm okay with things being rough. So let's start where the player will begin when entering this area. Behind the player is a daunting structure lodged in the side of a rocky wall. This structure is the entrance to the discarded temple, an abandoned place of worship, and also the first dungeon of the game. That's right, where you start the game is actually at the first dungeon. In the actual game, I plan for you to be placed inside the foyer of this dungeon, with seemingly nowhere to go but out the entrance. You'll wake up in a pile of rubble, and after leaving, the door will shut, and you'll see an ominous green rune glowing on the outside. The temple entrance has quite a bit more polygons than what would be on something like this on the N64. I wanted the entrance to be covered in a moss, with this poison being cycled through it. I really enjoyed making these little green flames on the outside. They're just a flipbook material with a small green point light to give them a little glow. The trees on the edges of the entrance are the same spiral trees that surround the location, but have lost their leaves due to the soil beneath them being contaminated by the poison. The same poison that's being circulated through these shafts. The poison can even damage you if you try to stand in it. Placing danger this close to the player right at the beginning will signal that this game is meant to be hostile. Along the trim here, you can see some sort of writing. And what this is actually a custom font I made, as I want the game to have its own mysterious language for the player to slowly decipher over their playthrough. My goal is to have not only context clues for the language and what each of the letters correspond to based on our alphabet, but to have actual ways of revealing what these letters and words are. A lot of people like the idea of the Guardians having a true name, which I plan to integrate using this language. It will be like an overarching lore puzzle for the people that care, and a nice way to add more aesthetic to the game. Turning away from the discarded temple, you can look out to the forest ahead. This was the first time I had ever modeled a landscape, and I'm quite happy with the results. It started out as a map drawn on my iPad, as I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to make. The total triangle count of the area without the trees and other objects sits around 6,000 triangles. I will say creating an entire area made of just plains for the first time definitely left me with some pretty scuffed geometry. There's still some collision issues that I'm working out, and I plan to modify it here and there as needed. I will say though, no matter how much better I get at level design, I will never redesign this area, as I believe it's a reflection of my game dev journey, and this game in a lot of ways is meant to be a metaphor for that. Because of that, I expect this area to have a simple and unique charm to it over time. Looking out from the small cliff, you can see a large spiral tree with a blue glow. I intentionally created this line of sight so the player would immediately see a point of interest to check out. Now I know what you're probably thinking. A forest, a character with a sword, a temple in the woods, a large tree. Isn't this just ripping off Ocarina of Time? I would say yes, if not for all of these things having completely different purposes in Trinity. It's also very intentional that these things are meant to feel familiar to the player. It's a way of subverting your expectations to create this feeling of familiarity while I feed you the main differences this game will have. While this may look like Ocarina of Time in ways, I plan for the game to ultimately have a different feeling than Zelda. Making our way down along the stairway, you can see how I use vertex colors to create ambient occlusion along the wall. If you don't know what vertex colors are, they're essentially colors that can be overlaid on top of textures, without them being destructive to the texture themselves. By using vertices on the mesh, you're able to color along them to create many interesting effects. While it wasn't used too much on the N64, I like to look at games like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask 3D on the 3DS. Here you can see how much variation in life that the developers were able to add to the environment using this method, and I think it's brilliant, especially when aiding in the limitation of a retro art style like Trinity. In front of the cliff, there are the pots that I showed in the last devlog, and while I wanted to have them functional for this video, I never got to it. They're not just randomly here though, they're actually serving a purpose. They hold a special water that I'll talk about more in the future. Looking up, we can see some fake god rays. Since my game doesn't use an actual directional light source, I still want to make it feel like there's lighting in a retro way. These god rays peeking out of the tree canopy are just hexagonal cylinders with an emissive material that is scrolling and faded out towards the end. I really love how they turned out, as I basically just made them with all the knowledge I gained through material tutorials. Next to these pots on both sides are small tunnels that lead into darkness. Currently they don't actually go anywhere, but the goal is to have them lead to sub-areas that connect back here. One of the things that people love about Dark Souls 1 is its interconnected level design, and while that game legitimately has its world connected in that manner, I won't be doing that in order to keep the retro way of having separate levels like in other N64 games. But I still want how these areas connect to make sense and make the player feel like the world makes sense physically. The area in front of the cliff will have some blossom sprites roaming around, which I plan to work on next month. There's also some tall grass which will be cuttable, since you can't have a Zelda-like without having some tall grass to slash, though I haven't quite given the player the ability to use his sword yet. I even added some non-cuttable short grass inspired by the way that Ocarina of Time 3D does its short grass. All of the foliage has this wind-blowing effect that I applied to the material. Despite this being another thing not possible on the N64, this is one of those things that I arbitrarily chose since I think it adds to the atmosphere without compromising the graphics. Another thing similar to this would be the spiral trees themselves. Definitely too high poly to be on the N64, but still considered low poly. I even dotted them around the perimeter of the level instead of using tree billboards. Though if performance was ever to be an issue, they would be the first thing to be replaced. Another thing on the ground is a flower called the prism bloom. This flower is part of a plant system that will be able to be picked up and used for special effects. The Prism Bloom's effect will give the player an increased chance of encountering prismatic guardians, which will be this game's version of shiny Pokemon, though that's a system we'll have to wait before talking more about. Another reason for the plant system is to not only have fun collectibles with unique effects, but items in general are going to be a very important way in which I'll be explaining the lore of Trinity. In the Souls series, I'm a big fan of how From Software uses item descriptions as a way of storytelling, as it's not only very simple to add text to a game, but it's a non-intrusive way to add depth to the world without getting in the way of gameplay. The lore will be there for the players that seek it and out of the way of the players that don't care, and I think it's important to cater to both kinds of people. Making our way along the right to this path, we reach an introduction to the platforming I plan to add to Trinity. This is going to be a way that I'll be making Trinity feel different than Zelda and Pokemon. I think having good movement in games is fun, but I also want to have a reason to have better movement and a dedicated jump button. I would say the platforming in this game would be between Ocarina of Time and Mario 64. These platforms have been eroded away by the poison that has caused a massive sinkhole. I really love the effect of the poison as it uses multiple overlaying materials scrolling across each other. I even added black vertex colors to the pit to make it look like it goes into a void. This sinkhole acts as a bottomless pit and will instantly kill the player if they fall in. Originally I had a death screen, but I put it off for now as I want to work on the respawn functionality, which as of now just respawns the player in the middle of the map. But in the future we'll respawn the player at checkpoints very similar to the bonfire system in Dark Souls. And just like the poison coming out of the discarded temple, the poison here can hurt you. You can easily run out of it without dying. It's here to not only teach the player about environmental hazards, but to add context to the environment around it. I do plan on modifying the jump and potentially adding a ledge grab into a jump. I don't want shimmying in this game, but I know some people would like the ability to not just face plant into the wall if they miss the jump. Though I did add coyote time, which delays the falling state, so you have a grace period in which you can still jump when leaving a ledge. Whenever I make my own animations, I'll be trying to add better platforming features. Jumping all the way up here, you will find Philip. Though he won't actually be up here in the final version of the game, but a key item will. Like I said, this is the first platforming section of the game, so it's not intended to be very difficult. And while attacking isn't implemented yet, as I said earlier, I did add an early lock-on. I wanted it to feel a little retro with the spinning reticle. I even made custom sound effects. I did this by combining different sounds and tweaking different things using various effects. While we're on the topic of sound, I'll go through some sounds I added to the game. First we have 3 random jump sounds, 3 random landing sounds, footstep sounds along with some clinging metal, these will be tweaked over time, 3 random hurt sounds, ambient forest sounds, and a waterfall sound from the poison pit. And here's what they all sound when put together. All of the character sounds were actually me, and I shifted the pitch up slightly to make the player character sound younger. On the rock next to the entrance of the poison pit area, there is a succulent plant. Succulents will be found near dry or hard surfaces. Succulents will provide a reactive effect, unlike the prism bloom, which is a flower that provides a proactive effect. This specific succulent is called a flowered death gem, but I'm not quite ready to talk about its effect. But essentially, just like in real life, this succulent is flowering, which means it's on the brink of death. So maybe you can speculate on what its effect might be. I also intentionally put one here next to the platforming section. Going directly across, we sadly find an unfinished section. See, like I said in my previous devlog, I'm sharing my progress every month regardless if it's presentable or not. I feel like this will give people a better understanding of the work in progress state the game is constantly in. Game dev can be a very rough process, and I just want to show that. But as you can probably tell, this is another platforming section. The goal of this section is to lead to an area where a powerful guardian will reside, that you may or may not be ready to face. That's still a ways away, but that's the goal for this. Also on this stump, we can see the final plant of this area, or should I say mushroom. Mushrooms are the 3rd type of plant in the plant system, and they will give you a negative and positive effect, so you kind of have to ask yourself if it's worth using. This fungus in particular is called the twisted flesh cap. Just like the trees in this area, this mushroom seems to have a twisted appearance, as well as even having a glowing blue liquid on its cap. The twisted flesh cap will slightly increase the damage you deal, but also do the same for the damage you take. It's something I see more skilled players using and more cautious players probably avoiding. Over here we see an unfinished pathway that will lead deeper into the forest. For now there's not much to say, but there will be more encounters and stuff to do in this direction. Across from here we have a similar unfinished path, but this way will lead to what many call the Breath of the Wild moment. This will lead to a cliff with a view of the world you're about to explore. And while this game won't be open world, I do want the world to feel massive. And I oftentimes think that limiting where the player can go can make the world feel larger than an open world game, as the player never truly knows how much there is to explore through the perspective that they have to play with. I really want this game to feel like Dark Souls plus Ocarina of Time plus Breath of the Wild, but there's still a long journey before I can get people to experience that. Lastly, we have the main attraction of this area, the large glowing spiral tree. This is called the Great Spiral Tree Spring. Springs will function similarly to springs from Zelda, but also fused with bonfires of Dark Souls. You'll not only start healing when you walk into the waters, but by interacting with this orb of water, you'll be able to level up yourself and guardians and fast travel to other springs. This will all be talked about more when it's actually implemented. This orb of water is called Everlasting Water. It's a physical manifestation of something called the Current, which is a spiritual energy connecting all life and guardians in this world. Guides are able to tap into this current with their spirit arm. And as you can see here, you can even target the Everlasting Water Orb, and it shares a similar spiral to what's on your hand. There's a specific reason why you can do this, and it's called Spirit Lock-On. This water is what gives life to everything in this universe, and part of the motivation of the game is to purify it to stop corruption and stagnation, and mend the damage done by humans. There will be more about this in the future and when people play the game. This tree has essentially harnessed the power of the everlasting water and is using it to not only grow itself, but to rain the water back down onto the life below, creating a never-ending cycle. That's also what's creating these waterfalls behind it, which I'm honestly really proud of how this area looks back here. Not all springs will look like this, but they will have an everlasting water orb at them. Like I said before, water and its properties will play a big role in the themes of the lore of this universe. And that's pretty much all I've done this past month. I honestly don't know if people will think this is a lot, but I kind of feel like it is. The amount of stuff I learned how to do makes me really happy. I've gotten so much more comfortable doing things even on my own. I have a nice list of things I can work on, and it's all leading to an eventual demo. With that being said, not every devlog will feel like a lot of progress was made. This devlog heavily focused on the visuals, as that's what I like the most. So it can seem like a ton was done. The next devlog will definitely have more mechanical and gameplay related things, so who knows how much will actually get done. Thank you all for the support, it's been very enjoyable so far, and let me know your thoughts below. I'll see you next month.